Now we are going to discuss the third part of generativism, and that is principles and parameters. Principles or parameters are core components of universal grammar and the understanding of universal grammar. Universal grammar, as we have just discussed, is usually defined as a system of categories, mechanisms, and constraints shared by human languages and considered to be innate. So this is due to their innateness and innate ability. It comprises of all these systems which are considered universal. These are generally thought to include formal universals, and that take us to the understanding of principles and parameters, as well as lexical categories and features. We will discuss and emphasize basically the understanding of principles and parameters. Universal grammar consists of a set of principles and a set of parameters. The principles are universal. That is, they apply to all human languages. However, the parameters vary from one language to another. That is, the parameters of the language according to language input that they receive from the environment. So parameters are environmental specific, whereas principles are universal for all languages. So let's discuss and let's see in terms of analogy or a little example. Principles. Principles are true and universal to all human languages, whereas parameters vary across languages. Drivers have to use one side of the road, that's a principle. Driving on the left side of the road, as in England and Japan, is a parameter. It does not say which side of the road people should drive. The principle is that drivers should use one side of the road, but the side is not specified. However, in the parameters, you have the specification of either driving on the left side or the right side. So universal principles and variable parameters sum up the essence of driving. The principle says the universal requirement on driving. The parameter specifies the variation between the countries. Principles are related to the structure dependency. They exist that knowledge of language relies on the structural relationship in the sentence, such as words and morphemes, rather than on the sequence of words. For example, the boy eats food. Now the structural relationship, the boy eats food, it has noun phrase, it has verb phrase. Then that can also be further divided or looked into as small units. For example, the boy, noun phrase having the determiner as the and noun as boy, and also verb phrase, which is eat food or eats food, has a verb which is eats and then noun phrase. So you see the structural relationship of the words which are given in a particular sentence. Parameters, they refer to the pro-drop parameters. Pro-drop parameters are also known as pronoun dropping parameters. Whether subject pronouns can be dropped in a language or not. For example, I understand Chomsky's theory. Understand Chomsky's theory is incorrect. Now, in English language, we do not have pro-drop parameters. You have to have a subject, which is I. In Spanish language, you can have pro-drop language, that is minus subject. Other parameters include binary parameters, which are head initial and head final. In English, you have read the book. Read is the head initial, whereas in Japanese language, book read where the head is basically at the end. You also have the governing parameters, which is the relationship between reflexives and their non-phrase antecedents. For example, Mark wanted Tom to treat himself. Here, himself can only refer to Tom, not to Mark, as the reflexive must be bound with a local domain in English. In other languages that allow long bindings, such as Chinese, himself can be either Tom or Mark. Now we will show you a small clip of Noam Chomsky. When he was in one of his lectures, he was asked about his views on the ideas of universal grammar and principle and parameter, that whether they have changed over the period of time, or is he still convinced about his conviction and his views on the universal grammar and principles and parameters.
Well, if you could work that out, you'd have solved the paradox. It's a long way to work that out. But that made it possible at least to confront the issue seriously without facing an immediate near self-contradiction. And it set off a lot of a really rich period of research and inquiry, and nothing like it in the thousands of years of history of study of language in the last 25, 30 years, of a wide variety of typologically different languages, new questions at a depth that could never have been proposed before, sometimes answers leading to new questions, and so on. It's been a very lively period. And it also raised another question. What about the principles? Where do they come from? And the fact, the choice of parameters. Where do these things come from? If they're in universal grammar, if they're part of the genetic endowment, then they had to evolve somehow. But not a lot could have evolved because it's too recent. You know, you go back 100,000 years, there's, as far as we know, nothing. Humans had the same anatomy. Anything that's preserved in the fossil record is about the same, you know, hundreds of thousands of years back. So some small change must have taken place in the brain, which somehow allowed all of this to suddenly blossom. And pretty soon after that, again in evolutionary time, like maybe a couple of tens of thousands of years, which is no time at all, humans started leaving East Africa, where we all come from, as far as anyone knows. So some small group developed this system and then spread all over the world, and now they're all essentially the same. But what evolved in that short period of time cannot have been very complex. You know, you wouldn't expect a series of extensive stages, like, say, development of limbs, you know, millions of years. Therefore, what you'd predict is that some other principle external to language, maybe some principle of nature, a principle of computational efficiency or something like that, which is not specific to language, interacted with a small mutation which just gave rise to universal grammar. Well, that sets forth a new goal of research, to see if you can determine that the principles themselves do not have the intricacy that they appeared to have, but are actually the result of application of non-linguistic, in fact, maybe non-human principles, like general principles of computational efficiency, to whatever small change took place. And the small change was probably the capacity to carry out recursive enumeration, basically, the capacity that gives you the number system, for example, to take two objects already constructed in the mind and make up a new object out of them, and then keep that process up indefinitely, so you get an infinite array of possible expressions, each with some semantic interpretation and some mode of externalization, speech, sign, whatever it may be. That would be, and the goal would be to try to show that that was essentially instantaneous. Once the small mutation took place, given this operation, the recursive enumeration operation, it allows you to create a discrete infinity of expressions, structured expressions. Well, that's at least a feasible picture. The trick is to show that it's true, or how close it is to true. Can you cut away at the apparent complexity of the principles and show that they can actually be accounted for in terms of general principles that hold for organisms generally, perhaps, and maybe even elsewhere in the physical world, and that are instantly or almost instantly applied once the original move is made to whatever small move it was to produce the capacity for recursive enumeration. Well, that's a goal. It's far from being attained, but in the last 15, 20 years, there's been considerable progress towards it. That is, a lot of things that it seemed 20 years ago you had to assign to the genetic endowment have now been rather plausibly shown to be possible consequences of just application, particularly of principles of computational efficiency, to a system which had only the ability to construct an infinite hierarchy of expressions. And that, we don't know enough about the brain to know how that might have happened, but that could have been a very small mutation, just changing something in somebody's genome and then spreading through the small breeding group. So that, in that respect, it's a goal, and steps have been taken towards it. But you would expect that something like that ought to be true, just from what's known about the history of evolution of Homo sapiens in very recent times, without much opportunity for selection to have had any effect. Maybe a small effect, but not much. So that's, I think, that's the tendency of thinking, at least my thinking, and many others, on how theories of universal grammar have changed. But the idea that there is universal grammar, that it exists, that can't be controversial unless you believe in magic, for the elementary reasons that I mentioned.
Languages, then, according to Chomsky, are the virtual image of each other. And the idea that universal grammar exists cannot be controversial unless you believe in magic. To conclude, Chomsky believes that language acquisition cannot be reduced to the operation of response and stimulus. Every sentence we utter contains a new set of words or a mixture of new words. Language is regulated by large number of rules, principles, and parameters.